So to start doing two things at once. Before I share the Torah, I think it'll be obvious when I'm reading from the Torah. I was in my first set of interviews for my first ever real job, we could say. I interviewed with a very prominent congregation. I was one of many people who interviewed with them. And they had a rabbi who was very successful as the senior rabbi. And in the interview, they came to the campus to interview a series of students. In the interview, the congregant who came with the rabbi continued to look at me during the interview and say the same phrase over and over again. He kept saying, "You have to understand, this is America's rabbi." And I was nervous for the interview, and now I've got this guy telling me that I'm in front of America's rabbi, and I couldn't hold it together. I didn't get the job. But the idea that America would have a rabbi that represents all of America at any one given time in my lifetime has never been the case until this week. How can we not look at what Rabbi Citron Walker has done in this last week and the way, I think amazingly, in which he has gone in front of the media and talked to reporters and been on. If you haven't listened to his interviews, I would highly encourage you to do so on CBS and NPR and CNN and everywhere else where he's been interviewed and spoken incredibly well. And for this week at least, he's become America's rabbi. That being said, I continue to believe, and my point tonight, which I think the Torah portion helps us to make, is that America doesn't need a chief rabbi. That has never been what we have desired. And it actually, while wonderful to watch, is not what saves us from anti-Semitism. So, let me share the first of three sections of the Torah portion. Vayishma Yitro Kohen Midian, Chotain Moshe. And Jethro, a priest of Midian, who was the father-in-law of Moses. Vayishma et kol asher asa Elohim lemoshe ul Yisrael amo, ki hotzi Adonai et Yisrael mi Mitzrayim. Jethro, a priest in Midian, who was Moses' father-in-law, listened to everything that God had done for the Israelites when they came out of Egypt. In rabbinical school, we spent half a semester on just this verse. Because the rabbis, the medieval rabbis, they asked endlessly, how on earth does a priest from another religion hear God doing God's work for the Israelite people? And what did he hear? Their shock is that there would be somebody who doesn't know us or understand us or recognize us and who is not a part of our tribe. They can't imagine that somebody would listen to what is going on in our world. And yet, as we read the story, what Jethro does by listening first opens up a whole world for Moses. And so the first lesson or lens from this Torah portion this week is, are we able to listen to those who aren't in our own world? Having lived in Los Angeles, and perhaps you could say in Atlanta as well, but I attach it most to Los Angeles, in a city where you live in your car from place to place. Even though I loved living there, one of the challenges I always felt was you really didn't know who was around you because everybody was in their own bubble. You went from your house to your school or to work. There was no reason to interact with anybody in between. And anybody who you might see on the street, you couldn't hear. And if somebody was sitting in their car yelling or screaming or joyous, you had no idea because you can't hear anybody other than yourself. And there's great peace in that at times, but there's also a great sense of disconnect. This week, one of the challenges that we faced, that many is now a part of a national Jewish discussion, is the incredible silence after what happened on Saturday. I want to quote my good friend and Rabbi Danny Berkman, who's in the Boston area. He wrote the following, and I think it's the best sense of how many of us have felt this week. He writes, "A terrorist attack was perpetrated on American soil, with American citizens held hostage in their place of worship for 11 hours. But in the aftermath, there was almost silence. Yes, there have been interviews with Rabbi Charlie, and yes, there has been some coverage of events in the news. But this should have been the front page story. It was at the bottom of page 10 in the Boston Globe on Sunday, in case you were wondering. Rabbi Charlie should have become a household name for his courageous and heroic actions. And where were the messages of support for the Jewish community? Where are the lawn signs standing against anti-Semitism or standing with Congregation Beth Israel? Where is the outrage about what happened?" I had the same experience. I watched last week as if Tree of Life was happening again, but the difference was that it was quite different. It wasn't on every news station. They didn't cut out of the latest gossip as I flipped through the channels in order to tell you what was happening. And even the next day, as Rabbi Berkman says, it wasn't the front page of the papers. If you remember, 3 years ago, there in Hebrew letters on the front of the papers was Mourner's Kaddish. And this year, for some reason, it's page 10. There are lots of theories, but let's continue with Torah. So, the first thing Jethro does is listen. The second thing he does is act. Now, here's how the Torah says it. V'yikach Yitro choten Moshe, and Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, took et Tzipporah, Eshet Moshe, his wife Tzipporah, the wife of Moses, Achar Shlochecha, after she had gone to return home, Ve'et Shnei Baneha, Asher Sham Ha'achad, Gershom, and her 2 sons, the first of whom's name is Gershom. They like to tell you why he's named that. He's named Gershom, Ki Amar Ger Chayiti Be'eretz Nochreha, because he was a stranger in a foreign land. V'sham Ha'achad, the second son, Eliezer, and he's named Eliezer, Ki Elohei Avi Be'ezri, V'yitzlenu Mechorev Paro. He's named Eliezer because Elohei Avi, the God of his father, was Be'ezri, his help, and saved him from the sword of Pharaoh. V'yavo Yitro choten Moshe uvanav ve'ishto el Moshe el Hamidbar asher hu chine sham har ha'Elohim. And Jethro brings the family of Moses, his wife and his sons, out into the wilderness to where he is camped at the foot of God's mountain. First, Jethro listens. The second thing, he doesn't say a word. The second thing he does is he acts, and he goes and he takes the wife and children of Moses to meet Moses where he is. And so the second lesson of this week, it's not just that we don't hear each other, but even when we do hear each other, we're not responding to each other. Following Pittsburgh, we showed up the next morning here, and our doorstep was flooded with cards and with chalk writing. People had immediately gone into action that day. We had countless emails and phone calls, and within, I think, 72 hours, if I remember correctly, we had a vigil at the JCC so large that we couldn't even fit in the room, with speakers from all different faiths and different communities. So maybe people hear what's happening and still don't respond. This time, I heard multiple times from our friends at the mosque. They responded. I had 3 emails from them. Wonderful outreach both during the hostage crisis and once it was resolved. But as I'm thinking about this week, I'm also listening to the news. There are nurses at hospitals who are in COVID floors who, because of the protocols, they don't have any help, so they have to take the food to the patients. They have to dress the patients' beds. They have to do the job of 3 or 4 or 5 people. And as we know, many of them are choosing to leave their profession. And a nurse that was being interviewed is telling us, in feelings quite similar to how I felt last Saturday, this is a crisis. Our nurses are walking out the front door of our hospitals and you won't get good care. And he's saying, but nobody's responding. This morning on the radio, they're looking at the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade and it possibly being overturned. And they interview the people who were activists 50 years ago and they say, what are you going to do? They say, we're too old. Most of us aren't even around anymore. It's up to this generation and we're not sure if they're going to show up. I talked to a friend, a Jewish friend, about this issue of the silence we've heard this week. She says, I thought about all the people, the black men who've been hurt, and I didn't call anybody when it hit the news. I didn't think to reach out. Somehow, whether COVID has forced us into our cars, our bubbles, like I lived in LA, where we don't listen to what's happening, or whether COVID has told us that we're so tired of constantly caring for other people and solving crises that we don't have the energy to try and solve another one. It seems to be that somehow we're not taking the second step of acting, at least not as much as perhaps we could. So the third section of the Torah portion. Finally, Jethro says something. Vayomer, and he spoke, El Moshe, to Moses, Ani chotencha, I am your father-in-law. My name is Jethro. Bo elecha ve'ishtecha, I come to you with your wife, Ushnei baneha, and your 2 children, Ima, with her. V'yotzei Moshe likrat chotno ve'ishtachavu, and Moses came close to him, he bowed down on the ground, vayishach lo, and he kissed him. This, perhaps, I think, is the most beautiful line of the portion. V'yishalu ish l're'ehu l'shalom. And each one of them turned to each other and said, how are you? Shalom. V'yavo'u ha'olah. They went into the tent. V'yasaper Moshe l'chotno et kol asher asa Adonai lefaro u'mitzrayim all odot Yisrael. They went into the tent, the 2 of them alone, and Moses started telling his story. The story of the Israelite people who overcame great strides with Pharaoh and left Egypt, and who now were on their way, Matzatem bederech v'yatzalem Adonai, on the path that God had laid for them. V'yachad yitro al kol hatova, and Jethro saw that this was a good thing. Asher asa Adonai leYisrael, which God had made, Asher hitzili miyad Mitzrayim, that he had brought them out by a strong hand from Egypt. And this, I have to say, you should all take a deep breath, because this is a moment you should be in awe, because it's a shocking moment in the Torah. It won't feel like a shocking moment to you, but if you put your mindset into the mindset of the ancient Near East, Jethro, a non-Israelite priest, turns to Moses after hearing his story, and he says words that will be familiar to you. Vayomer Yitro, Jethro said, Baruch Adonai, Asher Hatzil Etchem. Blessed is Adonai, who's brought you out and made you free. The conclusion of the story of Jethro is he sits with Moses, he listens to Moses' story, and then he blesses him. So this week, what I feel we've missed is not having a rabbi who is America's rabbi. We've never needed a rabbi who represents all of us, not one who speaks for us or directs us or saves us. We've always needed other people, friends outside of our community, allies who hear us and act on our behalf and know us face to face in conversation. We've needed a Yitro, somebody who can sit with us. And some of that's on us. We have to roll down our windows. We have to speak about what it feels like, and some people have been doing that this week. I'm not very good at doing that. I prefer to post pictures of my dog, as some of you saw. But the truth is, part of the problem of living in LA is that you're in your own car, and you have to roll down your window, and you have to speak up and say what's going on if you want somebody else to react. So we need to share with our friends what this week felt like. And we need to remember that we're not unique. This was our week in which we felt the feeling of victimhood. But other weeks, there are other victims, and we have to be the ones who speak up. And of course, there's a COVID factor in all of this. We have to listen better because COVID has separated us, and so we don't hear people's stories in the hallway, and we don't bump into them in the mall, and we don't see them at holiday parties. We have to find the energy to act, to send a note, to make a call, to show up, virtually or not, because COVID has exhausted us, and we have forgotten, in a lot of ways, how to show up for people. And we have to relearn how to be with each other around a table, at community vigils, and around a dinner table. This is the time of year in which we start our Interfaith Justice series, where we go and learn about justice, but as for any of you who've participated, then we sit down and we have a dinner that's longer than the discussion. And it's the time where we have a community Seder, where we welcome 100 people into this space in order to have the experience of Passover. COVID makes all of these things near impossible. So how are we going to gather around a table with people who have a different story than ours? How are we going to relearn that skill? I don't know yet, but I think that this week's story, as I hope you feel, is a great reminder of how important it is. Yitro goes on to mentor Moses. Moses goes on to lead the people with Yitro's advice not to do it alone, to do it with other people, and he elects judges. So we'll read that down the road. I want to close with this prayer, and then we'll conclude our service. Holy One of blessing, grant us the will to stand firm in the face of evil and hostility, not to be silent or afraid, to work diligently and faithfully to banish wickedness from the earth. Holy One of blessing, grant us the courage and resolve to speak when there is hatred, to act when there is confusion, to join with others in building a world of safety, understanding, and acceptance. Because there is hate, dear God, help us heal our fractured and broken world. Because there is fear, dear God, grant courage and faith to those in need. Because there is pain, dear God, bring healing to the shattered and wounded. Because there is hope, dear God, teach us to be a force for justice and kindness. And because there is love, help us to be a beacon of light